Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is John Livesay, also known as the Pitch Whisperer. John is a sales keynote speaker and shares the lessons learned from his award-winning sales career at Conde Nast. He has been interviewed by none other than Larry King, and his TEDx talk has had more than 1 million views. If that sounds familiar, that's because it is. John was the first ever guest of this
Mhm.
podcast, a whole 93 episodes ago. And when I introduced him that first time, I said he was the nicest salesperson you ever meet. And he still is. So when I found out that he had a new book coming out, The Sale is in the Tail, I knew I wanted him back on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, the man, the legend, John Livesay.
Oh,
John,
Francisco.
welcome back.
Thank you. That's such a nice welcome back. Very kind of you. Looking forward to it.
All right, so full disclosure here. When we spoke and I found out that you had this new book coming out, The Sale
Hmm.
is in the Tail, and I found out that it was a business fable, my first reaction was, oh no, this is going to be terrible. Well,
Oh,
you are you, and I have great trust in you. But
uh-huh.
I have seen business fables before,
Hmm.
or have people using fables in business before, and that can sometimes be incredibly awkward.
Hmm.
So, what made you decide to because you have a book on storytelling,
I
so
do.
what made you decide to do this book this way?
Well, I have seen both great examples. I think there's a wonderful fable, business fable called Getting Naked that Patrick Lencioni wrote. I was very compelled by that ability. But I haven't seen anybody write a business fable about sales. Usually it's about thinking positive or leadership or consulting. So I thought, oh, there's an open lane here. No one's done a business fable from the perspective of a salesperson. And since you and I both love storytelling, I thought if I can pull this off and entertain the readers or the listeners, if it's an audio book, where they feel like they're in the story, then it's literally a story about storytelling. And as we all know, when you show something instead of just tell it, then people are pulled in. So that was the purpose for writing this business fable.
I think the biggest problem, the biggest obstacle in my head was something that might just be a misunderstanding, and it's the word fable. Because
Mm,
when I think of fables, I think of something from the days of yore. I'm thinking of Hans Christian Andersen and stuff
yeah.
like that. And I very quickly realized within about 3 lines of your book that it happens in modern times
Oh,
and it's
yes.
dealing with modern issues. So what is the actual definition of a fable? What makes it a fable instead of
Mm.
just a fictional story?
Well, I think the big difference is that much like Who Moved My Cheese, which was written many years ago, that was a very big success put in the genre of a business fable. The purpose of it is to take you on a journey, and that some of the things that might happen, you are willing to go on that journey in a different way than if it was just strictly here's the details of how to be a better storyteller. The and compared to a fiction book, I think fiction books can, like a James Bond or something, that's much more, you suspend your belief. But a business fable in particular versus just a fable usually is grounded in some reality. In other words, the protagonist or the hero in this story doesn't suddenly start making all these sales the minute he starts to use the story. He still has some obstacles to overcome, which is what happens in real life.
Yeah, I think from reading it, my impression was that the only part of it where perhaps the whole suspension of disbelief thing was slightly tested was, well, one, when there is not one, but maybe two or three different characters in the book that seem to have very relevant John Livesay advice to dole out.
Mhm.
And the other part is just how thorough that advice at times was.
Mm.
Because apart from that, if it's not that, and those are the parts where you think, okay, well, clearly this is when the author wants me to
Mhm.
learn some of this content.
Yep.
But apart from that, which is well spread out throughout the narrative, uh, it's just a fiction story, and at times a very entertaining one. I found myself very caught up in Ben's adventure, Ben, the slightly crappy salesperson,
Yes.
and his adventures in becoming a better salesperson.
Wonderful.
So. Uh, I think it might just be that this idea that because it's a fable, it is and it's expected that you have an agenda, which is teaching people something, and that
Mhm.
at times it will become pretty obvious that this is the educational part of it. Whereas
Right.
if you try doing that with a fiction book, and authors I think try that sometimes with fiction because they have a political agenda, for
Mm.
example. Those are the points that people go, wow, I'm not sure I'm liking this, because
Mhm.
now he's trying to convince me that this thing is good or that thing
Right.
is bad. um but let me just leap from that. Well, actually, let me just say one more thing, that I did really enjoy it. So
Oh, good. I'm glad.
I
Yes.
want to make sure that's on the record.
It's funny because when you're introduced to a new concept, what was fun about writing this fable was you can sort of anticipate someone's initial pushback. Like, what do you mean? I don't understand. And allow for dialogue between characters to sort of clarify something, as opposed to just assuming that it's so obvious once you read something that you understand it and can start implementing it. So that was also part of the nuance of people going, oh, I can relate to Ben. And we know the best stories are the ones that we see ourselves in. So I'm so glad you were able to relate to his journey.
And one thing I picked up on that I don't think necessarily the rest of your readership will pick up on is that a lot of the stuff in the book, not only the stuff you're teaching, the stuff you're teaching, I'm familiar with because I'm familiar with your work,
Mhm.
but a lot of the corporate examples or the
Mhm.
storytelling success stories that you're using
Mhm.
come from your work with real companies, right? I noticed at
Yes.
some point the Gensler case story
Yes.
there, the architectural firm. I think
Mhm.
Diane tells that one, and I
Yep.
think is it, I there is a company called Athena Medical, right?
There
Or
is
no?
not. I There's a
Okay.
company called Olympus Medical, and so this is
Which you worked with, yes,
yes, and so this is a
yes.
fictionalized version of that
Okay.
company.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I thought it was that, but I had a quick Google for Athena Medical, and there is something. There is some company that is, Athena something
Mm.
medical, whatever.
Mhm.
So I thought, this is a bit odd if he's talking about a real company. But then I realized that you've done a lot of work with Olympus Medical,
Mhm.
and then
Yes.
some of the stuff came from there. So what I want to know from this, from having done this, is something to do with the idea of stories being real or being fictionalized, because I think the vast majority of people that work in storytelling tend to prefer the idea of real stories,
Mhm.
stories that actually happen to you or to your clients.
Yes.
Now, this is a book; it's a very different way of sharing stories. So I don't think anybody would have an issue with this being a fable. But what are your thoughts on people using hypothetical stories or
Mm.
or fictionalized stories, as long as they're being clear about it, on instead of just using stories that actually happen? So I'm talking about either you as a speaker using that when you're
Mhm.
speaking to people or giving a workshop, and but
Right.
also people in sales, for example, using
Mm.
hypothetical stories instead of something that has actually happened.
Well, when you're giving a talk or a sales presentation, I think it's very important to be authentic and only tell stories that you know to be true. When you're writing a fable, you have a little bit of freedom to say, this happened to me 30 years ago. I had a bad boss. I can tell that story through the story, and give some sense of what that was. Or this happened to me, but I'm going to have it happen to this character. My sister is in the book. She happens to be a younger sister. I made her an older sister. So she'd have a little more credibility giving me advice. So there's some things that I took liberties with there, but the essence of those are the stories in the book are all based in reality.
I'm sure your younger sister feels fully entitled to give you advice.
Oh yes,
Age
but as a
difference.
reader, you'd be like, "Why
Uh,
is he listening to him?" Her. So yes.
well, I think the reader would realize that Ben is someone who needs a lot. Ben, the main character, is someone who needs a lot of advice. I don't think anyone would begrudge him, or have any issues with him taking advice from his younger sister or anyone else. To be fair.
Yes.
Yeah, no, with the fictionalized story, I think it's interesting because I've come across a few different examples where people take the other a different approach. So the most extreme example I've come across is with someone you might be familiar with, Kelly Swanson, who's also a storytelling keynote speaker, and she has created this whole fictional world. And she has this, they come out in blog posts and YouTube stories and whatever, and she says that she has actually started sharing these fictionalized stories from her fictionalized town in her keynotes. And it says, it's kind of obvious that you're telling them what is a fable, right? You're
Mm,
talking about the baker in this little town that has a name that sounds a bit made up.
mhm.
And I think once the point becomes obvious, no one is going, well, but that wasn't real, because it's such a thing that could, it's a thing that could so obviously be real that
Mm,
nobody cares that you use the story to illustrate the point. The
right.
same as if you're using a movie, for example, to
Yeah.
make that point. But that I don't mind so much. But I've seen people that talk about storytelling, and when they start trying to explain to companies how to do it, it becomes an exercise in fiction where they're saying,
Mm.
imagine your client avatar, imagine the things they could go through, and now create a story that reflects all those things. And I'm always thinking, surely you have some stories that
Yes.
actually happen. Why are
Yeah.
you bothering with all this fiction?
Right. One of my favorite things to do is turn testimonials or a case study into a case story. And after people read the fable, there are five storytelling secrets broken down into templates and scripts with examples from my experience that hopefully people can go, oh, I now can start implementing these because there's certain steps to follow. And I just insert my actual experience with clients or um, struggles I've had taking myself to get to where I am.
Yeah, so I want to delve deeper into some of those things in a moment. I just want to clear some stuff out of, not out of the way, but I wanted to touch on some other things
Okay,
first.
sure.
So one of them is this something I just came across this again a couple of days ago. So I one of the things I do is I teach at an MBA,
Hmm.
and then we were working on how to open and how to close a presentation, and obviously I was talking about stories as one of the ways to do it. And then one of my students came out with something that I've heard a million times by now, which is this resistance to the idea that using stories, for example, work in the corporate world or in
Mm,
corporate presentations, that doing things without a million slides or slides that have walls of text is acceptable, or the old, oh, but in my company that wouldn't work,
hmm.
right? And you have a character in the book, Karl, who's not the nicest of bosses. I
Every
think it's
story
a
needs a little bit of a villain, right? Yes.
Yes, I think it's a bit of a coincidence. There's a very famous podcast in the UK called the Peter Crouch podcast, and they had one listener who was an absolute knob, or a douche, as Americans would call him, and he was called Karl, and
Mm,
Karl became the shorthand for them for idiot. Like, don't be
funny.
a Karl, like
Ah,
you're being a Karl.
we have a phrase like that here in America. Don't be a Karen.
Ah,
So,
yes, yes, but
mhm,
but I think it's slightly different though. Carl in that case is just someone who's being like an obnoxious idiot. I think
mhm,
Karen has different connotations.
yes.
But yeah, so you have this boss that is very skeptical about the whole storytelling thing.
Hmm.
So, in your experience, both in the work you've done before becoming a speaker and the work you do with companies now,
Yes.
how much do you find that still a big thing, that
Mm,
there is one person or a culture in a company that people are
right.
pushing back against. Yeah, it sounds great when you're doing a keynote, John, but like, I've got 10 minutes to do this presentation. I haven't got time for this. Like, they're
Mm.
not going to give me the time for that.
Well, I'm happy to say that it's been a big shift. Uh, 3 years ago, I was being hired to be a sales keynote speaker for a recruitment firm, and I was speaking to the CEO, and he said, "I'm not sure I understand the connection." And I said, "Okay, you have to present against competitors to win a new client." Yes. And we always ask if we can be the last one to go because we think that'll make us more memorable if we're last. I said, "But you can control the order you present. So your strategy is hope." I said, "If you tell a case story during that presentation instead of facts and figures, you'll be memorable. It won't matter if you go first or last." And then the light bulb moment went on. And he went, "Oh, now," and I told him an example of another client using that to win a big account. And so I don't usually have to spend a lot of time anymore explaining why storytelling is important to sales. In fact, I've had many clients in healthcare and tech reach out to me saying, "We know we need storytelling in our marketing materials and what's coming out of our salespeople's mouth. And that's why we want to bring you in." So they're actively seeking me and finding me through a SEO or referrals or whatever. So that is really nice to skip that first step of having to connect the dots between storytelling and sales.
There is a concept you talk about in the book, and I've heard it before, but I've not heard it described that way.
Hmm.
So can you talk a little about this idea of that stories are for the meeting after the meeting?
Yes. We all realize this, but I don't think we think about it. So typically, if a client, you know, is interviewing us to be one of their speakers, they usually boil it down to two or three speakers. Or if you're the one pitching, presenting, you're one of three finalists, and you have a chance to come in and pitch, tell your story, however you want to describe it. So after they've heard all the presentations or had all the meetings, they have the second meeting, the meeting after the meeting, which is where they sit around and they say, "Well, what did you think?" "Well, they all sounded the same. I guess we should just go with the lowest price." Or, "Well, I love that story Francisco told us about how he was so great at another event. That's what we want. Let's get him." So whoever tells the best story is the one that stands out. And oftentimes there's some very senior people in that second meeting that did not hear all the pitches. They depend on their team to make a presentation or a recommendation. And so if you've told a story that someone can remember and repeat, then you've really achieved a competitive advantage.
Yeah, this is a concept I talk about when I give my keynote, because I've been talking a lot to HR people, so sort of the leadership HR space. And
Mhm.
this is one of the concepts when we're talking about things like purpose or a
Mm.
company strategy. So, if your employees need a 10-page memo or a mouse mat or a mug with the company's values to remember them, then you have a problem.
Mm.
If, whatever is it, if it's a strategy, if it's your purpose, it's your values. If people, or the mission statement, which is one of the worst wastes of time that a lot of companies have, is if those things are not memorable and easily
Mhm.
repeatable, then they're never going to work. Nobody's going to, it's not going to catch, it's not
Right.
going to spread around the organization and make their way into the way people actually behave. So you need the most memorable thing you can have. And it doesn't need to be a story, it could be a catchy slogan or something like that. But in most cases, it just makes more sense to be a story, because then you're building the examples of what you're talking about in the story. It's not just, well, we value integrity and transparency. Yeah, what does that
Mhm.
mean? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's
So.
something that everybody can say, so then it loses its value. I think one of the best examples I've seen of a company doing something that allows people to share it as a story about their mission statement values is during the pandemic. Olympus Medical was giving for free the use of their equipment that would allow doctors in other locations who didn't feel safe maybe being in the surgery, um, to watch what was going on and could contribute and make comments without everybody having to be in the room when a pandemic first broke out. So their value of really caring about the doctors and the patient's safety was in action with that donation, which is one of their values, put into an action, put into a story. Now people can remember that story. There's visuals to it, and um, it's great when you can see it, and um, then you have an emotional connection to it, which is the whole goal of a story.
And it's great to hear that you're finding there is less resistance to the idea of the stories.
Hmm.
But how much, and again, maybe this helps our business model to a great extent, but how easy do you think it is for most people, or in practice, how quickly do they take up these ideas? Because what I found sometimes is when it comes to presentations or pitching or anything like that, we're
Yes.
giving people, we're not just refining what they're already doing, we're changing the way they do
Hmm.
things. And everything sounds amazing in the keynote, everything sounds amazing in the training, they might even do it and do it very well in the training. But then
Mm.
sometimes what you find is, 6 months down the line, a year down the line, the vast majority of those people haven't actually changed dramatically the way they're doing things, because the resistance of doing something new crept in when they were busy with other stuff. So again, what has been your experience with that?
When people are at their, like, yeah, any problem, when it's at the breaking point, you're not making your numbers, you're coming in second place when against your competitors, and you can't figure out what it is. Or you have something that's more expensive than your competitors, and you know you're gonna have to come up with something. I have found that the people that start to test, will storytelling work for me, and then start getting sales faster and easier without feeling pushy, that's their personal incentive to keep doing it. They're like, oh, this feels easier to me and to the person I'm presenting to. So there's a big incentive that you're not just saying you're going to win more sales, which isn't the truth, but you're going to feel better doing it. We all know people are motivated from their self interest first. So if this makes me feel less pushy and I have to say less because I'm not pushing out every detail of every feature, then they're like, I'm in.
Yeah, I think it depends on how quickly people have the opportunity to try it, and if they have the opportunity to try it early on, and they try it and they get reasonable results from it, then you probably got a convert for life. Where I think sometimes is a little more difficult is if you teaching this to people that are not necessarily going to use it straight away, a month down the line, the impact of those learnings has been diluted by a million of other things, and then they might end up not doing it. So I've tended to find that whenever we have a chance to work with any company, it's better to build some type of follow-up into whatever you agree with them, because if you the greatest training, the greatest workshop or the greatest keynote, I don't believe would generate change on its own if they never ever hear from you again,
Mhm.
even if it's just an email
Mhm.
a few weeks down the line saying, okay, so let me hear about the stories you've been telling so far,
Yes.
and they have to go, oops, maybe maybe this is the thing I was meant to be doing.
Yes. No, I usually offer a 30 and even a 90-day follow-up, and then a lot of companies will buy my online course to supplement the talk in the workshop, and then there's, goals and assignments with those, things so that after 90 days, that storytelling is part of the culture, and it even becomes an onboarding tool for new salespeople to listen to other people's story of origins, to get to know each other personally, as well as the case stories until they have their own sales. They can start using other people's case stories of what's worked.
Yeah, so let's get a bit into the weeds of some of the stuff that you teach people, and there's a line in the book that it's said as a joke, but
Mhm.
then when I saw it, I was like, but is it really a joke? And I think Ben is the main character is talking to Diane, who is the person who teaches him most about storytelling,
Mhm.
and his summary of what he should be doing with a story is. don't be the hero, don't be complicated, and don't be boring. And
Exactly.
they kind of laugh. But to a great extent, isn't that a pretty decent summary of what most people of what most people realistically should be aiming for when it
Exactly.
comes to telling
Yes.
stories?
And once you hear all of those things and you can boil it down to three things, then you're like, okay, that's the basics, and that's my minimum. That's my checklist, right? Well, if I look at, am I making myself the hero of this story? That's not right. The client's supposed to be. Is this confusing? Well, no one's going to ask me to clarify it, and is there any emotional tug here? Is it compelling in any way, shape, or form? So, um, yes, it's like anything. The reason why it's sort of played off as a joke as, oh, if it's only that simple, you still need to practice like any new skill. But yes, those three things are crucial.
Yes, I I just yesterday I posted something on social media where it was the sort of five most important points anyone needs to know when it comes to telling a good story, and it took me 69 seconds to cover them. And the points were figure out what the point of your story is. Once you know what the point of the story is, the characters need to be doing something early in the story that shows them clearly they didn't know what they did
Mm,
whatever learning they got at the end, they didn't know that thing in the beginning. So if they
right.
if they learned about engaging clients emotionally in the beginning, they're clearly not doing that, they're just giving them information or facts. um, Once you know that, then start with time, place, and make that beginning as close to the end as possible, so you're not wasting anyone's time. And then add some details and some dialogue, and off you go. And I said, well, people are like, oh, you're giving away all the secrets. I was like, yes, sure, because now I've told you these five things. Everyone is a master in this, and nobody's ever going to hire a
Yeah.
story coach or a storytelling speaker ever again. But
No, it's he definitely. I recently was working with a healthcare company, and they, you know, offer a place for people to go who have dementia or Alzheimer's. And I was getting, they said, you tell us to make these stories compelling. Can you give us examples or give us some more tips on how to make something compelling? And I said, sure. There's a little bit of neuro linguistic programming where if I say the car door slammed, some people will hear it, some people see it, and some people feel it. So if you involve all of those elements in your story, that pulls people in. So they said, well, one woman came in and she was so depressed she'd put her head down on the table sometimes. I said, okay, that's a good starting place. But let's give her a name. Tell me how old she is and use all those. So now they say, oh, we had someone here. Her name was Pat. She was in her mid 80s. And sometimes she would feel so sad that she would just put her head down on the table with a slight thud. And imagine how sad and depressed you have to feel to not even to want to look up and see what's happening in your surroundings. So we took just a basic one thing and amplified that to make that more compelling. And they went, oh, now we understand those, as you said, the description, the details make that little moment much more compelling. Because some people go, oh, I heard the thud.
Yeah, so the word you used just there is one of the things I wanted to ask about, moment. So this
Mm,
is one thing I swear by, and I know a lot of people that talk about storytelling also swear by that, is that the best stories should have a moment. Some people
mm,
would describe this as a scene.
mhm,
The story should be a movie in your mind, so there's a scene where things are happening in real time with lots of sensory details and all of that. Now, in the vast majority of stuff in this book, for sure, I can't remember exactly what you taught on the better selling through storytelling, but in this book, for sure, you didn't make that as one of the main things people need to be looking for. So a lot of the examples in the stories, they don't necessarily have that moment or scene. I think the doctor one, when he comes out of the
mhm.
operating room and talks to the family, is one example where there is one. But
Yes.
there's a lot of other stories in there that don't necessarily have a scene with lots of sensory details. Was it a deliberate choice to not go that much into uh, to go so deep into the how to make a story compelling in this particular book?
Well, I think if teaching people differences between don't end your story just where there's a solution, but have that resolution to the story, that resolution often is the moment without labeling it the moment. Because I wanted the people using storytelling as a sales tool to not have to learn a lot of nuances of storytelling as much as here's 4 steps I need to make my case story compelling. And if I have something in the resolution, 9 times out of 10, that will be the moment that makes someone say, I want your product or I want to hire you because of that resolution. Life after your talk or life after buying the product is so much better that I've seen myself in the story. I want to go on the journey with you.
Yeah, this is the challenge I think a lot of people that work with story have, because on the one hand, once you're used to telling stories with very vivid details and dialogue,
Hmm.
e- for example, I find it very difficult to tell a story now that it doesn't is not centered around the moment. So most of the stories I put out on social media now, or use on my keynotes, they're mostly dialogue and
Mm,
something happening in real time. And now we find it very difficult to tell them otherwise.
yes.
But for a lot of people, that is not the most natural way of doing it. And if
Mhm.
they tend to tell more than they show when they tell stories.
Right.
So yeah, I see the point of, you just want them telling stories. If they get used to telling stories and the pieces are generally in place and they want to make those stories more compelling, there are some easy things that they can do once they've mastered the structure and
Exactly.
it built the habit. But yeah, I get why you might not want to have that as one of the main things.
And certainly
um,
the exposition, I said, think of yourself like a journalist. You must have those basic who, what, where, when details explained to pull people in to the story and paint the picture. And that example of that woman head on the table was the exposition that they then went on to describe um, the case story of what life was like for her after she went to their place.
one of the 5 secrets in the book is what you call a story of origin, which
Hmm.
I and a lot of other people call the origin story.
Hmm.
And there is a criticism to that I've heard a few times, and I wanted your take on it. And the criticism is this: so the origin story for anyone, or the story of origin for anyone who doesn't know, is the one that answers the question, why are you here? Like, where did you come from? Why are you
Yeah.
doing this thing? Why is this important to you?
Hmm.
And your prompt on the book, at the end after the story, to do this is think back to childhood, or when you're deciding what you wanted to major in school. Was there any indication that you would end up here?
Hmm.
Which I think is, eminently sensible. But the question then that I've got, the pushback I've got from some people is, are we not trying at times to not fabricate a narrative, but sort of
Mm.
force a narrative as if everything I've done over there was always leading up to here, when life tends to be significantly more chaotic than that. I don't know if you've heard that before as a bit of not a
Um,
criticism necessarily, but a
yeah.
challenge to the idea.
Well, sometimes people have trouble finding their story, but I would say the people that I get to work with that are passionate about what they're doing, there's usually because you have to put yourself in the buyer's shoes again. Let's go back to the example of, you have to put your one of your parents in a Alzheimer or dementia facility. It's no longer safe for them to live with you or, by themselves. Um, and the person says to you, I just took this job because I couldn't get any other job. Versus, oh, when I was 12 years old, I used to take care of my grandma and I would paint her nails for her. And then when she got too sick to live with us, I would go visit her. And by the time I was 16 and had my own life, I would still drive and, hang out with her and her friends. And that's what made me realize I wanted to do this as a career. Um, that's much more meaningful. That's who I want taking care of my parent, not somebody who goes, well, I couldn't get a better, higher paying job. So that's why I'm here. So I think if the person's, and sometimes it's nothing dramatic with an architect. He said, I was 11 years old. I play with Legos. That's what got me and now I have a son that's 11. I still play with Legos with him. So those moments don't have to be this long, drawn out, dramatic story. It can just be some hint of something that got you to be interested in this. And certainly any actor that you meet, because people, that's an example, people usually are really passionate about what they're doing. They can remember the first play they ever went to. And that's what made me know I wanted to be an actor. So ideally, there is something in your background that allows you to tell an authentic, meaningful story so people have a sense of who you are.
Yeah, I, f- I don't have any issue with the idea that we are trying to spot things in our past to make the journey make a little more sense, because I don't think it's all accidental, and I think often there is a connection. And I've gone through when I went through the exercise myself to try and to write my own origin story. I ended up unearthing all sorts of somewhat
Right?
complex and at times troubling facts about my childhood and my
Mm,
motivations. Then that I can't possibly say for sure that they made as much sense in real time as they seem to make sense to me now, but there are a
hmm
lot of connections that I never made. I was like, but why did that thing lead to that when I obviously liked something else? I was like, oh, it's because I was
hmm
worried about this. Oh, hold on, wasn't I worried about this when I made those other choices too? Spotting a trend here. So yeah, so I think there is no perfect story from where we were in childhood to now, but just because it goes every which way
Right.
doesn't mean that there isn't a path there that
No.
makes some sense of
And
things.
sometimes it can just be something as basic as, oh, I was in the Israeli army before I took this job. Oh, well, you must have learned a lot about focus and discipline. And since your job now is making sure a budget and a project comes on time and under budget, you got the perfect background. So you can look at something you were doing in your recent past and say, what lessons, what skills did I have that would make me a good person doing this job now? So we don't have to, it doesn't have to be this painful therapeutic experience. It can be something as simple as that too.
Yeah, so talking about therapeutic experience, I I there is something you've been talking about for a very long time that
Mhm.
you don't brand as storytelling as such, but I've now seen other people start branding that as storytelling. So there is something you've been talking about for many years, which is stacking your moments of
Mhm.
clarity.
Certainty.
So
Mhm.
yeah, so can you just explain that, and then I'll tell you where the hell I'm going with this.
Sure. It's a confidence tool I have where so many people get intimidated in certain situations, especially if the stakes are high. And I said, our monkey mind will take over and say, this is never going to work, or you really need this money or this job. So instead of that, I say, write down 2 or 3 times when you knew you nailed something. Your wife said yes to you when you proposed, you got a big promotion, you got a big sale. And not just those moments, but the feeling associated with it. I felt happy, exhilarated, proud. And you recreate that feeling in your head right before you walk into the presentation or the Zoom call to pitch. And that is a nice boost of confidence for people. So it's a nice exercise.
When I read about that the very first time in your first book, and I think it's on the TED talk, right,
Hmm
too. So when I read it the first time, I think my first impression was, wow, that this sounds very useful. I'm not sure this is storytelling as such, because I think I came
Hmm.
across particularly in
Oh,
the book as in a storytelling book.
yeah.
But obviously I was wrong, because and I don't know if you know this, but Kindra Hall,
Yes, it's the
um,
story you tell yourself. Yes.
but yeah, so her she's launching a book now, and her
Hmm
whole focus seems to be going towards this idea of the stories you tell yourself and how to
hmm
tell yourselves better stories. And in many ways, the moments stacking moments of clarity just seems very similar. I mean, yours came much before, but seems very similar to telling yourself success stories instead of the usual imposter syndrome stories that a lot of us have about many things.
Yes.
But I hadn't made that connection that essentially all you're doing is find those stories of success. You don't necessarily need to tell yourself the whole story, but
hmm
have those stories in the back of your mind and how they made you feel. and think about that before you go into any challenging situation. So yeah, that's that's why I
Yes,
said
well,
you didn't brand them as storytelling. You call them moments of clarity instead of
yeah.
stories of success.
Again, from being in sales myself for so many years, I realized we're all going to have moments of insecurity, imposter syndrome, rejection, and so much of it's mindset. And so I wanted to include that as tips for your mind before you tell the story. Because you can have a great story, but if your mind isn't feeling confident, the story won't come across well.
The other, but the book has one other tool that I don't think I've seen you talk about before. I don't think it was in the original book, which is something you called in the book. I think you called 555.
That is new content. Yes.
Okay, go and so explain to everyone what the hell that is.
Well, again, we all have moments where we get rejected, we get disappointed, we get frustrated. And I thought, how am I going to deal with this? How long am I going to keep thinking about this? And for me, when those moments are happening, I can say to myself, somebody cuts me off in traffic. Some people that flips them out. Me, I'm like, I'm over it in 5 minutes. Somebody else is still mad for 5 hours later. So the 555 method is literally just say to yourself, is this going to matter in 5 minutes? 5 hours? How about 5 days from now? And when you zoom out and like a movie director, on a scene, like, oh, 5 days from now, I'm not going to, why am I giving this so much energy now? And if it's something more severe, like not getting a promotion or maybe a death of a pet or a family member, you think, yeah, this is still going to really be painful. Then you can use another version. Okay, so 5 days from now, how about 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years from now? You think, oh, I'm still going to miss my dad, but not at the same pain level 5 years from now that I have right now. So I think it's a really wonderful, useful, memorable tool that it's like, oh, wait, let me 555 this to get me out. Because it's all about how fast do I get back up after I'm knocked down. And zooming out like that with that time frame has really helped me. And I've seen it help a lot of other people.
Yeah, I like how you say I've seen it helped a lot of people and not I've seen it help everyone, because I know some people in my family and my mother-in-law to be exact, where
Uh-huh.
things that should not have mattered 5 months later still matter 15 years
Yeah,
later.
you're still holding on to that? Really? Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I remember I think I've come across before this idea of, is this gonna matter in your deathbed? But the
Mm,
problem with that approach is that there's almost nothing that's gonna matter in your deathbed. I mean, you might
yeah,
hopefully care about your friends and family, but there's
yeah,
pretty much nothing else you're gonna care. So it's like,
yeah,
oh, I've just completely destroyed my career. Is it gonna matter on my deathbed? No, not really.
yeah. That's too big of a leap of time for us. So, this 555, it just reminds you you're always a choice of how long you hold on to something. And so, it's another version of, again, I'm the movie director of my own story, and I can yell cut at any time. So if it's up to me, we're like, no, we're done with this in 5 minutes. Moving on, next scene. Or, all right, I'm going to still think about this for 5 hours and make myself miserable. And that's where it really gets tricky because if you let it go, then you can't keep telling your friends about what happened to you. Like you
Yeah.
won't believe what so and so said or did or blah, blah, blah. You go, no, no. If I'm going to let this go in 5 hours, I'm going to give myself 5 hours to call everybody I know and complain about it, and then I got to stop.
Yeah, I think I've explained that concept before, as in, we are the writers of our own story,
Hmm.
and we get to decide if it's the end of the story or just the end of a chapter. If this is the end of, if it's really bothering you but it's just the end of a chapter, not the end of the story,
Yeah.
does it bother you so much? Well, no, because I guess something more interesting is going to happen later, or something better will come, or this will become the lesson or the challenge that makes me better in the future. Then I'm okay with that. Okay, well then there you go.
What you just said is so key there. It's either you have the mindset of abundance or scarcity. So when something doesn't happen, we go, well, that was my last chance at love. That was my last chance of ever getting to be hired as a speaker again, or ever making a sale, or whatever we can do to ourselves. You're like, no, no, no. There's plenty of people that need what I have and are willing to hire me. And that person said, no, that's fine. I'm moving on. Versus thinking about it for weeks afterwards. And the need to get back up fast is the secret to success.
Yeah, I think that there was one example there that you used about the things that might be harder to get over, and it's something, unfortunately, I know we both share, which is having lost a pet. And in
Mhm.
my case, it's been now 11 years or 12 years, and I can't talk about it much without without
Yeah,
tearing up. So
I get it.
i I think some of those, I mean, obviously it doesn't hurt as much as it used to,
Right.
but I guess there's some of those wounds are remain somewhat painful for a very long time. But then again, what we got in return for them, I think in most cases
Uh,
is
a
is
friend of
worth it.
mine asked me when my pet died, if you knew now how unhappy you'd be, would you still have gotten him? I said, yes. And that really helped me go, okay, that's what life is. If I remember once being in therapy and the therapist said, your feelings are like on a dimmer switch. And if you only want to feel this much happiness and this much sadness, you're not really living. So your willingness to feel sadness allows you to have a higher range on your happiness. So I'm in. A lot of people go, I can't take that pain again of losing a pet. I'm never having another pet. That's not how I feel. I know it's going to hurt, and I know there's going to be a lot of joy. So it's that muscle we build up of that, just as an example of my capacity to love. So and express and feel, and that's what being alive is for me. So instead of resenting it or regretting it, or I just look at it as I really have a deep capacity to love and feel that much sadness that much later. That's great, because then my feelings on the dimmer switch are a big range.
Yeah, there's something to as well to the idea that most people don't have never thought about, have never really considered, and I don't think are anywhere near being able to live with, which is that the whole sandcastle idea, right? So if you're on the beach and you're playing with a child, or your
Yes.
child or a nephew or whatever, and like you can have as much fun as they are having, but a wave comes over and destroys it, you're not going to be heartbroken because it's a sandcastle. It was going to fall apart at some point.
Yeah.
It was a given. um, but when it comes to almost anything else in our life, we really tend to struggle with that idea. But hopefully that's not the case with our children.
Mhm.
But for pets, I mean, that is a given, right? You get a dog, you know that if you're very lucky, you might get 15 years with that dog, or 20 if it's one of those tiny things that people call dogs these days. But but
What? What are you
it's
talking
it
about?
but no, that's an actual dog, right? A
Yeah.
very cute one. John is lifting his dog, which is not a like one of those dogs that people carry around in purses that can
No, no,
barely move by themselves. That's what I
he's
mean
15
when
pounds. Yes.
yes, yeah. So my wife had a dog that lasted, was it 18 years, 19 years? It was a
Wow.
little toy poodle, so I'll barely call it a dog, but 18 years, whereas most dogs of a reasonable size, 11, 12, 13 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is something where we we really struggle with the idea that those stories, to bring it back to the
Hmm.
topic, are they have an end. We know what their end is, and we if you look at them as part of your bigger story, then you can try and find some meaning in it and
Mhm.
use that meaning to lessen the hardship of dealing with the difficulty of the thing when it happened. But if you don't, then it's just more painful. And this is one of the reasons why I think that having a habit of telling stories
Mm.
can be psychologically very useful, and healthy, because you're constantly trying to find meaning in things.
Yes.
And if you don't like the meaning you're finding, then you can look for a different meaning, but you need to do the exercise.
Well, if you go into sales, you know you're going to get rejected, and we're all selling ourselves on some level. And so if you think, huh, if that person says no to me, does that mean what I have to offer isn't good, or that I suddenly am not good? We take the no personally. And so that's why it's so important to know going in, you're not going to get a yes every time. To everyone who interviews you to be a storytelling keynote speaker is not going to say yes. Sometimes it's a fit, sometimes it's not. And how you deal with that for the next conversation, if you drag that negativity in, then you've already lost before you've opened your mouth. But if you instead flip the script and go, whoop, that was no, the next one will probably love me. And if they say no, you don't give your power away.
Yeah, there's another way I've heard of expressing that idea, is you win or you learn. That's it.
Yeah, either
Well,
one.
not. I know a lot of people that either they win or they lose. They never learn anything.
Yeah, it's just
In an ideal world, you win or you
yeah,
learn.
right.
All right. So one thing I will be very curious to find out, and I don't know if there's any practical way for you to ever find this out, but I, our whole concept, our whole theory about storytelling, which has in many ways been substantiated by science, is how much more memorable stories are than anything
Mhm.
else, and how teaching something through a story is a better way to teach things. So
Yes.
I would be really curious if there was any way to ever make that, find out those numbers of, if we compared someone who, for example, went through your online course, um,
Mm.
compared to someone who read the new book. And if you had to test them a few days later, or a week later, or a month later, who's going to remember the main concepts or the main lessons from
Mm.
it better? Because, I mean, in theory, the book should be significantly better at teaching that than
Yes.
your online course or a workshop. Not so much, because people will be doing things in practice, but then a keynote would. Now, I've no idea if there's any way to ever test that, but if you're ever able to test that, then there's more data you can use in your own keynotes and pitches.
Yes. Well, the goal is that the story, the fable, has sort of awakened you to the concept of it and the need for it, that you start using the methodology at the back, or decide I really want to double down and take the course, or I really want to bring John into my team to make this come to life and have everybody read the story so that we can reference the story in our weekly calls and start taking some of the tips about opening up meetings with celebrating progress. So there's a lot of details in there that have I've seen really work.
All right, so the book is called "The Sale Is in the Tail," and it's coming out on the 18th.
Of February, yes.
Okay, everywhere books are sold, I guess.
Yes, you can pre-order it now.
And I will add my last review, might not be quite the word, but my endorsement, in that I have read, was it The Greatest Salesman? I forgot the
Hmm.
name of that book, from Ogmandino, which has sold like a bajillion copies everywhere, and I thought it was all right. I wasn't overly impressed with it.
Mm,
Perhaps because its wisdom has now been so repeated over the
mm,
years that
mhm.
there was nothing particularly new in that book. But that is a business fable, essentially. And I've, as we've touched on briefly, I read your book from cover to cover, the whole 156 pages of it, in the space of, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 hours, yesterday, and I thought was very entertaining, and there's a ton of good content about storytelling in
Ah,
there.
thank you.
So I think that if you have 1% of Ogmandina's success with that book, you'll be pretty
I'll be
happy.
thrilled.
But
Yes.
to my taste, it's a significantly better book for sales today than the greatest salesman is. So there you have it. For whatever that's worth, you have my full
I
endorsement
appreciate that. No, it
of
means a lot because you love stories. So that's the goal, is that the story's compelling enough that you don't want to put it down and that you learned something and then want to know more. So that's the whole purpose. So thank you for having me back and for taking the time to read The Sailors in the Tale.
All right, and if anyone wants to find out any more about John, johnlivesay.com. I'm gonna put links to that in the show notes. John, it's I had no doubt that would be the case, but again, it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time. And as John's alarm is going, it is time for us to finish. It is the perfect way to finish. All right, everyone. Until next time. Bye bye.